Psychological research. Since the dawn of consciousness, humans have pondered the inner workings of their minds. Primitive civilizations looked to the skies, falsely linking constellations with personality traits. Other groups conjured up myths and supernatural explanations about where we came from and how the mind works. Well, we've come a long way since then, and as history has progressed, we have tripled our lifespans due to technological and cultural advancements, yet the brain remains mysterious. So how can we gain some insights on that gooey glob between our ears? Ask a guy who dedicates his life to studying human behavior and decision-making across cultures. Will Bennis is a cultural psychologist with a PhD from the University of Chicago. He's invited us to his business, Locust Workspace, a shared office space for local entrepreneurs, where he's going to share with us his views on research psychology and the relationship between the brain and the environment. Hi, my name is Vincent D'Iso. I'm here with Louis Risk, and our guest today is Will Bennis. Will, thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for inviting us to Locust Workspace. Can you start by telling us a little bit about Locust Workspace, what it's all about, and why you started it?
Sure. Locust Workspace is a co-working space. If you're not a freelancer or a software developer, you might not have heard of co-working spaces. They're relatively new. They started in 2005 or so, and they're shared offices for freelancers or other location independent workers who used to work from home or from cafes, or maybe they were just they had their own private office, but they're people who want to be around other people when they work. So if you've worked as a freelancer for a long time, you might have experience that you procrastinate, or you get unmotivated, or you get depressed, or you're just lonely, or you're not learning from other people anymore because you're always in your own flat. So co-working spaces are kind of designed with the idea that they're not just shared offices. They're places where you kind of are part of a community. So you sit in a big room, usually you're alongside other people, you go to lunch together often. Often there's events for community building. There's also ongoing educational events. So maybe about how you market on Facebook or different kinds of talks like that.
And are these things popping up all over the world?
They are popping up all over. I mean, the growth is phenomenal. The one that a lot of people have heard of because it's a business story, it's amazing, is called WeWork, which is now valued at like $20 billion.
Wow.
One co-working space with, I think that one space maybe has 100,000 members in their multiple locations around the world.
Where did that one start?
That one started, the two guys I think are both Israeli, but it started in the US, and I'm not sure what city it started in. Yeah. It started in 2010. I mean, it's crazy growth for one space.
Yeah.
But there's a lot there, just Prague right now. A lot of people are using the term to say this is a co-working space when really it's just a shared office, and there really is a difference. Like it's like a airport business center versus you're actually getting to know each other and you're actually sitting.
You're distracting other people from their work.
Sort of. Like, I mean, it's different. Like people here are here to work, and if somebody comes in and is talking really loud, it's going to annoy people.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's the kind of place where we do have a weekly lunch. We have a weekly coffee break, and people join it.
Yeah.
And a big part of why you're here is because you do get to know the people you're working with. We have a ping pong table. People do stuff together.
It's a community.
It's a community. And it's the original guy who coined the term co-working started in like a yoga studio building, just rented the place one day a week. But his basic statement is, I think, the real motive behind most co-working spaces, which is, as if you work for a traditional company, you have a lot of good things. You have support, you have feedback, you have people you can ask questions to, but you also have a lot of really bad things. You're competing with the other people you're around. You're being judged on superficial things.
Right, politics.
You don't get to make your own choices. You're not your own boss. So the idea of co-working is you can be a freelancer, you can be independent, you can be your own boss, but not lose all that structure and support you get with a traditional workplace.
Best of both worlds.
Right.
Best of both worlds. It's great.
And that's what Locust seeks to be, kind of.
Cool.
Excellent.
Cool. Well, you're doing a great job. You got a great view on the top floor here. So in addition to being an entrepreneur, starting your own business, joining this workspace community, you're also a research psychologist. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about. So can you just tell us about your upbringing and how you got interested in psychology?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it turns out to be common in US schooling and not so common in Czech education. I didn't study psychology until graduate school. In undergrad, I studied political science and philosophy. But I got interested in psychology and decided I wanted to study it. Took a couple classes and was able to get into a graduate program and was able to get a PhD in psychology, even though I started really late, which I don't think you could ever really do here, but I think and there's, good reasons in both cases, but I was able to start really late. What interested me or what got me started, when I was a teenager, I got in a lot of trouble. I got arrested. I had to go to court on a regular basis. I had to work to make restitution. I basically partied for a month in a house that didn't belong to me. My mom thought I was house sitting, was proud of me. The place got completely vandalized by the other people I was partying with. And like stuff got stolen, and I was the ringleader because I was the first person. I say to myself, I wasn't a bad kid. Maybe I was a bad kid. But like the minute we got in there, I called the kid whose parents' condo it was, and I said, we needed a place to drink this beer. We'll clean it up. We'll clean it up. I don't know if you saw Fast Times.
Were you the oldest kid?
I wasn't the oldest. I was just the one who, with one other kid, we had stolen a case of beer. This should not be.
At what age?
You're already incriminating
14.
yourself here.
Oh, you're 14 years old.
5 minutes in, and
we had stolen a case of beer from
incriminating
a beer truck in an alley, and we needed a place to drink the beer. I was with another kid, so I said, I have this friend. They just left town. It's the perfect place. We can go drink this beer. Probably there's a door open. So we got there, and there wasn't a door open. So we went up to a sliding glass door, and it wasn't open. And we're like, but he won't care. I'll just call him and tell him we're there. We'll clean it all up. So we used a hanger and broke into this house. So that kid who I broke in with left for California the next day and was gone the whole time. So I then was in there. I called him up. I said, hey, we're here. I was 14 and I was really stupid and I wasn't taking perspectives very well. So in any case, I got in a lot of trouble.
So let's reestablish your credibility here.
Yeah.
You have a PhD.
University of Chicago.
So, all right. You've come a long way from.
Yeah, I was 14 and now I'm 49.
Trashing houses. Okay.
So I got in a lot of trouble for this. I was the ringleader. Had to go see a psychologist. Had to go see a juvenile officer. Had to make restitution. Pretty much because the other kid left town right away and we were the two people. Almost nobody else got in any trouble. For me, I felt like I deserved to go to a juvenile home. What I did was so stupid. Mm-hmm. But it didn't happen that way. It dragged on for 2 years. And over that 2-year period, at the end, I thought I was going to get off probation, which in this case, I had to go to court first a lot, but then every 6 months. Thought I was going to get off probation, but I was doing really badly in school. I was getting D's and F's. So we'll put it back in perspective again. I was doing really badly.
Was this in high school or college? High school. You talked about
high school.
Okay.
I was 14 when this happened. I was 17 when I thought I was going to get off probation, maybe. I was 15 when this happened. I was 17 when I thought I was going to get off probation. Went into the courtroom, small courtroom like this, just my lawyer, probation officer, psychologist who I had to see while I was doing this. And I was getting D's and C's and F's, but hadn't broken the law or wasn't in any trouble. But part of the reason I got an F in one class is because I plagiarized on a paper. Maybe that's why I was telling you that kids plagiarize then too.
Is it easier?
They just didn't get caught. So I and the judge said I had been in the big courtroom before, just waiting for that to finish, and there was a guy who had been in prison for 7 years, and the guy said was doing really well, so he was up for parole, and they were saying all these things he did well, and then the judge says, but it says here you went to 2 different colleges. And he started to explain, and the judge hit the hammer and said, you're like a Coke machine that needs to get kicked. And said, go back to jail for 2 more years or something like that. And I was like, whoa. So then he came into the small room, exact same line he said. He said, you're like a Coke machine that needs to get kicked. Mm-hmm. And he said, you're going to go down in the basement, and that's the sheriff's office. They'll take you to the Jefferson County Youth Center, which is a juvenile home in Denver. And then you're going to go from there to a lockup school. This is the one I recommend. And it was like this school that you don't get summer holidays, which was really like the doors are locked. And so I'm sitting there thinking cognitive dissonance, thinking this must be what he's telling me is going to happen if I don't shape up. And then he hit the hammer and people left, and a sheriff came and handcuffed me and put me in a sheriff's car, and I drove for 4 hours to Denver and got strip searched and put into a juvenile home which is a prison for kids under 18.
Well, some really hardcore kids.
But just for 12 days. But hardcore kids, murderers, yeah, for sure. And it's the same, prison system where.
Did you have to beat somebody up at the beginning.
No, but the people were doing that kind of stuff. Like, really, no, like the big kids walked to the front of the line at lunch and nobody stopped that. It was clearly like part of the hierarchy. There was I took like, a half-hour math a week, and the math teacher came up. I was 17, said, "Can you solve this word problem?" And I was like, "Yeah," because he saw that I knew some math. And he's like, "Oh, thank you. I haven't been able to solve this." It was like, that was the math teacher. Yeah. So, and it was a basic word problem, like algebra. So it, one of the things that made me
go to the juvenile school?
No, but it makes you like going into a kind of kids prison. You realize that prisons in America, even juvenile homes, are not designed to be rehabilitatory. They're designed to take people out of the system, and they're just
babysitting these kids.
I mean, for sure, they're making kids less fit for society than they were before they got in. You're getting into the system where, like, being tough and being the top dog is what you do. I mean, it was clear, the recidivism rate, the rate at which you go back to juvenile homes, is 80%. That's a juvenile home, not a prison.
I think I also read somewhere that you become worse in prison, right?
Well, that's the point. I think, like, I get it. Obviously, it depends on the prison system. It depends, but to see that in a juvenile home where the whole point is they're not yet adults and they shouldn't be treated like adults, was disturbing. Even as a kid who doesn't really get the big picture, to me it was clearly this is a sick system. So anyway, then I went to this school. It wasn't the 24-month lockup school. In the meantime, my parents were like, "Oh my God, what's just happened? This is crazy." Because I really wasn't a bad kid. I was a stupid kid who made some pretty stupid choices.
And you got caught.
And I got caught. But in any case, so I then was sent to this school, which was a character education school. And the school was interesting to me. I thought a lot about morality, I guess. It was interesting to me because they really, really cared about values, and they tried to instill certain, as a lot of character education schools do, but this one was pretty serious about it. They had a certain set of values that they really every day worked on trying to teach the kids. And to me, whatever my upbringing or background, I was very much like a rationalist, in the sense that I really believed you have to know why you do the thing. So the interview for the school, that the president of the school said, if you like, why shouldn't you lie? Like, he gave this example of going to a gas station and there's too much, that you get undercharged for the gas. Should you tell people? And I said, yes. And he said, well, why? And I said, well, because you often get caught for stuff without knowing you will, so you should always just get in the habit of telling the truth. And it was a very like rational, cost benefit, utility oriented answer. Like,
not just based on
morality. You shouldn't lie, not just based on because it's a bad thing to do.
Right.
And he was looking for because it's a bad thing to do, and didn't want to accept me because I sounded like probably like a sociopath to him. Because like there's certain kinds of moral things that are just rules. So when I later decided to go to graduate school, that was the thing I wanted to study, was morality, because it intrigued me that we learn certain rules that we believe inherently are right or wrong, most people, without feeling like we need to justify them. And in fact, when you say, like, lying is wrong for reasons, it kind of diminishes the wrongness of lying. And at least in American culture, and once you study moral psychology, this is one of the basic ideas from the father of moral psychology. Is this idea that we learn that certain things are right and wrong inherently, independent of punishment, independent of, and that's kind of the highest
who is
stage.
The father of moral psychology?
This guy named Kohlberg, who kind of, I mean, I say that loosely. There are other moral psychologists. Piaget, who was this developmental psychologist, talked about moral development himself. But Kohlberg was kind of the one who he developed these stages of moral development that are kind of the foundation of moral psychology. So that's what I wanted to study. But in the meantime, I was really interested in evolutionary theory. So I was interested in evolutionary psychology. Why would we evolve to just be able to believe certain rules are right or wrong, independent of kind of cause-effect, cost-benefit analysis? What part of that is biology? What part of it is adaptive? So I was really interested in that, and that is why I went to graduate school originally.
And what did you focus on when you did your research?
Well, so this was when I went, and then, as always happens when you go and decide to become a psychologist at a higher level and do research, I think it's very, very few students who start a graduate program who want to be a research psychologist end up studying what they wrote they were going to study. And so I went to a program that was very interdisciplinary. It's a cultural psychology program. Cultural psychology is kind of committed to the idea that the way your mind works is inherently connected to the environment, so that you can't really we artificially separate them. We separate the brain from your development, from your culture, from your environment, but it's an artificial separation in a lot of ways. And so that was a big part of this department I was in. And when I was in this department and taking classes with people who think about this a lot, I became a convert in a sense. I was convinced by looking at research and hearing these cases that it is the case. So the example we were talking about before, which is right now, there were some researchers who wrote a paper which got a lot of press and a lot of attention because they did a great job. They did a lit review. A lit review is where you don't do your own research, but you look at all the other research done. So you do this meta-analysis of all the other research that's done, and you summarize it. And these guys are cultural psychologists, so they did a lit review. They called this paper something like, I don't even remember the exact name, but WEIRD was in the title. WEIRD with all capital letters, and WEIRD stood for Western Educated Industrialized Democrat. Western Educated Industrialized Rich Democratic. And basically what they did is they made a really compelling argument that cultural psychologists already knew, but this kind of covered it, that the vast majority of research in psychology is done with that group of people, with weird people. That was their first kind of case. And so they just summarized that.
This is
97% of research is done in these aren't going to be the right numbers, but more or less is done in European or American or North American universities. Maybe 90 or 85% once you put all these things together, with university psychology undergraduate students.
Right.
And we assume that's okay because they're people.
Right.
And they're normal people. We don't mark that group because that's who the psychologists themselves are part of that group.
Yeah, right.
And so we assume that the findings we get with that group are going to generalize. And so they would do that research, call that people. If you're using a sample of university undergraduate students, you can say that, but you don't really have to mark that as a unique sample because that's the sample that we feel like as psychologists incorrectly are the normal group. So that was the first part, is just to demonstrate how much of it is just with one particular demographic. And then the second part was to actually look at when psychologists do comparative research with these basic measures that we've always assumed or often assumed represent people. So they looked at the cases where we've done comparative research cross-culturally. And what they found was that overwhelmingly, not only is that group not representative, does not generalize to all these other groups, but it is on the extremes. So not only
Western society is on the
these
extremes
weird,
compared to the rest of
these
the world.
weird kids. So Western educated.
Right.
So it's really a lot of different things. So it's
small
industrialized,
demographic.
rich. It's a small demographic.
Yeah.
I'll talk about it a little bit because it's also interesting. What I think is their main, they didn't really put this in the paper because it's a more controversial claim, but what I think is their main explanation, I'll talk about what I think is maybe a different explanation.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, this group is the least representative. And so so the worst sample you could use in a way. So we're picking the one sample we think is the most normal is really the least normal.
And making generalizations about everybody.
About human psychology.
Such a small...
Not about undergraduate psychology
people,
students, but about
Everybody.
the mind,
Yeah.
about the brain. So this comes back to what I was talking about decision making. But so part of their explanation was, maybe that shouldn't be that surprising. That's the group that decided to study the mind, and that's a pretty big meta question itself. Maybe it's not surprising that they're different. But I think their main explanation, these guys are mostly also, they're cultural psychologists, but with a big focus, especially the lead author, who's a guy named Joe Henrich, is really big in the domain of cultural evolution and uses very kind of biological evolutionary mathematical models to try to and computer models to try to understand how cultures evolve over time. And if you look at Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic culture and how different that is, not to talk about it like evolutionary towards a direction of being more evolved, but talking about if you study anthropology and you look at how societies change culturally over time, hunters and gatherers, herder culture, cities didn't start until very, very late in human cultural evolution. And if then you look at specifically very industrialized cities, very large cities, states that are at the level of millions of people, that's Western educated, and they are the most arguably the most removed from our the time when we evolved as hunter-gatherers.
But even though a lot of us do live in cities, don't we still try to, gather our tribe? We have like 5 or 6 close friends, like as if we were still in a tribe. And as we walk down the city, we just ignore everybody else as if they're not even there. And we just think about our friends' lives, our families' lives. And so even though we're together, we're still...
Absolutely. So none of them, I don't think, would argue that we're no longer human, or that, but that we, if you looked at, so the idea that we still want tribes because this is how we evolved. We evolved in these smaller groups, and we only have kind of the mental capacity to form strong relationships. And this in-group kind of bonding is a big thing. It's a big topic right now in psychology in general. It's a big topic right now in business writing about this idea of tribes. I think most people would agree. Yeah, I mean, a big part of evolutionary psychology in general is this idea that our psychology was evolved in a very different environment, this environment where we had tribes.
It's still catching up to modern day.
Absolutely. And I don't know if catching up to modern day is how it would be worded, but basically that as this environment has changed, and this is a part of what their argument is so this environment we live in is really different, and our minds are kind of a product of the interaction between this evolved human and this environment we're in right now. So one of the interesting findings in psychology, controversial, all these things I'm saying are controversial, and I'm not endorsing any of the stuff I'm talking about right now, because I think there's a lot of good criticism to give to it. But one of the big findings is that if you look at mental health,
right,
Americans have the highest level of almost every category of mental illness around the world. And there's a lot of different explanations. One explanation could be, well, we're just measuring it more. Their explanation, I don't know if they really would believe this in this case, but if you buy this general argument, their explanation would be, we really are sicker because we are further away outside of the environment that we evolved to live in. We're not in nature. We're inside all day long.
You could say it's getting worse with our phones, right?
You could say all these, culture, the world we live in, this very technological culture, almost everything in our environment is artificial, is human made. And you could also argue, you could call that like maladaptive, but look at what we're doing. You could say these things are being evolved. They're just part of evolution. They're a cultural kind of extended genotype that is making us
we just need to adapt
more adapted. But it's a big interesting topic.
Now, do you think if somebody from a city,
who
doesn't know how electricity works and just doesn't grow their own food,
right,
if they were suddenly planted into somewhere in Africa or somewhere in Asia where you have to sustain yourself,
right,
do you think as an adult, not having learned those skills as a child, going in like maybe in your 30s, that you're going to be able to cope, you're going to change your totally change your personality and become somebody who can do that? Or do you think you're just totally screwed? Do
you guys know this book, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Mark Twain book?
Never read it.
Connecticut Yankee. So he's writing, this is a 19th century Connecticut Yankee, a Yankee, an American from Connecticut, somehow goes through a time portal. I don't even remember, but he ends up in King Arthur's court. Merlin's there. And he, coming from this future time when we have all this technology, is basically doing what Merlin does, but he's just using science. And when I read this book, one of the things that occurred to me is, gosh, those guys in the 19th century understood how the world works. If a 20th century American were put in King Arthur, or 21st century or whatever, if we're put in King Arthur's court, we would be helpless. We wouldn't be like Merlin. We would be like the dumbest person around. I guess that's the premise of this Idiotistan movie that I haven't seen, but I've heard Idiocracy. That's it. That you go to the future and that's what it's like, because nobody knows, because we have no idea how anything works. But so I think we'd be pretty helpless for one. Sort of like a kid born into a jungle without culture. We don't know how almost anything works. We have all this stuff. My mom always wanted us to learn a simple trade, like, make cement or learn how to do basic stuff, because come the revolution, we're all going to be helpless. So I don't know. I don't know if that was exactly your question, but
I mean, it kind of was, yeah.
Yeah, I think we'd be pretty bad off. But the fact of the matter is, we are not in that world. We are in a world where our knowledge is networked. We have this network knowledge that makes that none of us know. Not a single person understands Microsoft Word. There's not one programmer who could recreate that. It's a network project. There's an anthropologist who did research on nuclear subs, and basically that was the topic, is this whole idea of network knowledge, that there isn't anybody who drives a sub. You need a whole team of people that each have specialized jobs. None of them know everything. There's not one person that knows everything to run a sub. You need that network. But we have these networks. And I mean, maybe with some huge catastrophe, we will lose whole sectors of knowledge because we don't have the network that allows for it. But I don't know. So I'm just going to keep talking unless you guys want me to stop.
That's great.
Well, no, I wanted to ask you, because you're using a lot of terms. I just want to unpack these terms. Research psychology, cultural psychology. And I think most people, when they think of psychology, they're thinking of, you're laying on a couch.
Yeah.
There's some Austrian guy telling you your parents caused all your problems.
Right.
And,
Right.
you're supposed to talk. And this is so far away from that stereotype. So can you just define the differences between clinical, cultural, and research or...
Sure. So the vast majority of people who study psychology, especially undergraduate psychology students, but also people who end up getting, going on to a career in psychology, are clinical psychologists, or some person who's trained to work with clients to help them get better. So they're the person lying on the couch, if you picture Freud.
Right.
When you go to graduate school to get a PhD in psychology, you're almost never doing that. Not almost never, but that's the minority. And a lot of PhD programs in psychology don't even have clinical psychology parts. The research psychology is basic science, or at least strives to be. It's aiming to understand, how does the mind work? What explains human behavior the way it is? So it's a social science. We're not working with clients. We're not trying to help people get better. We're trying to understand, how does the mind work? Why do people behave the way they do? So the kind of definition is the study of mind, brain, and behavior is kind of a standard textbook definition.
Yeah, maybe we can get into that. So your background is in decision-making and judgment. Correct?
Judgment and decision-making, and culture.
Oh, and culture. So can you get a little bit more into that?
Sure. So yeah, just to say one more thing about the original question about cultural psychology, is just one of many branches of research psychology. So a cultural psychologist, a lot of psychologists wouldn't have even heard of cultural psychology because it's a pretty specialized area. But you have developmental psychologists, you have cognitive psychologists, social psychologists. All of those people who use those terms, evolutionary psychologists, as you mentioned, are different branches of research psychology, and they have kind of different commitments about what they study, or different methods they tend to use. So my focus is decision making.
And tell us why we make bad decisions sometimes.
Well, I'll try, but and especially I want to help you guys have a good title for this video. But the reason I got interested in decision making, so decision psychology is in some sense one big criticism of rational choice theory. Rational choice theory comes out of economics, and it's this idea that people are self-interested, rational decision makers.
Every one of us, right?
All of us. And if you make, whether that's true or not, if you use that as a heuristic, as a rule of thumb, if you make that assumption, it's the best way to predict how people will decide. And I think still today, most economists will say, yes, that's true. That's the best way to predict. From an economic perspective, that's the best way to predict how people will make choices. If you studied a little bit of American history, looking at the atomic bomb, you would have studied about the Bay of Pigs, about how close we were to launching preemptive nuclear strike against Russia, because we thought, if we're rational utility maximizers, if we're these people who are thinking about our own self-interest and we're assuming the other side is rational, the only rational choice is to be the first to act. So we were ready, and there were the best minds, mathematicians, economists, but really mathematicians who developed this decision rational choice model were saying, this is what you ought to do.
2003, right? The invasion of Iraq, it's the same thing.
Yeah, but this is back before Russia had finished developing the atomic bomb, but after we had it.
Yeah.
Or not, it was saying, they're about to develop it. We have to attack first. So, but yeah, same as 2003, same kind of idea. But this was like, we're going to wipe out a country.
Do you think maybe the leaders know this and they use it because they want to do what they want to do anyway? And then
Maybe.
They
I mean,
use
in
the
this case, the
rationale.
leaders were the ones who think God said no. You know, who said, look, these are the scientists, the decision scientists saying this is the way to go. This is the best prediction. This is the state-of-the-art science. We should attack. Not all of the scientists were saying this, but, you know, these mathematicians. So this is the birth of rational choice theory, sort of. So these great mathematicians who are now influencing economics, so started this field of rational choice theory in economics to say, let's assume people are this. So psychologists started to study decision making because they said, wait a second, this isn't how people choose. And let's look psychologically at how people really choose. And one of the fathers of the psychology of decision making, a guy named Herbert Simon, won the Nobel Prize, basically by saying, you know, that we aren't, first of all, we're just not smart enough in a sense. We're boundedly rational. He had this idea of bounded rationality, which was basically saying we have limited time, limited information. So in that world where we have limited time and limited information, we use what are called heuristics. And he had this one particular heuristic called satisficing, which was basically saying, like, if you're buying a car, you don't look at all the different variables and look at what utility each variable has or what value each variable has and try to maximize them all in some mathematical thing. You just see, does this meet my basic requirements? Mm-hmm. If it does, I'm going to buy it. It's called satisficing, basically. And this, he for a lot of other reasons, won the Nobel Prize, but a big part of it was this idea of bounded rationality. But still, economists thought, this is still the best model. We're going to assume people do this if you're trying to predict mass behavior. So recently, other psychologists working on the same thing, talking about biases and what influences how we make decisions, started to look at, like, to challenge this rational choice model, to say, okay, if this model is true, here's how we would behave. Set up all these creative experiments to show how people systematically deviate from this rational model.
Is that like the work of Kahneman and Tversky?
Kahneman and Tversky. And Kahneman just 10 years ago, I think 2004, won the Nobel Prize for this research on heuristics and biases. And
That's
just
the
this
book,
year,
Thinking Fast and Slow.
that's a book. His popular book that he wrote is
book.
Thinking Fast and Slow, but he's been doing research since the 50s, I think, or 60s, or at least 70s. But the 60s is when
With
a lot of
Tversky, right?
with Tversky. So Tversky died, or he would have won the Nobel Prize too. I should know exactly when they started doing this, but
A while ago.
And so I mean, it's been 50 years of doing this research, and now if you look on Wikipedia or whatever, you can see a list of all these heuristics and all these biases.
Yeah, can we talk about some of these biases of why people make some decisions that aren't very rational?
Sure, absolutely. So I mean, the big three in the heuristics and biases are usually distinguished from each other. So heuristics are rules of thumb. It's this idea that we don't kind of weigh all the costs and benefits and make a maximizing choice. We use basic rules of thumb. So the are really big two that I'll talk about. One is called representativeness, and it's that we think, we were talking about this a little before the video started, but we tend to think things are more representative than they are. So if we have a small sample, we will generalize that to the bigger sample. So the example of, we were talking about the hot hand, which is a popular one, that we see somebody shooting really well in basketball. We assume, okay, they're hot. We should get them the ball. And one explanation for that, what researchers looked at that, and they found that there was no correlation.
Right.
And even from the free throw line, there's no correlation between you performing above average and continuing to perform above average. That basically that's just chance. But we perceive it. Somehow we're perceiving these small samples, and it feels like the coaches say it, the players say it, the fans say it. They are performing better. They're hot. It's predictive of their future behavior, even though that's false.
Right.
So one explanation for this is something related to this representativeness heuristic, that we take that small set of above average performance, and we take that to indicate that their general performance has changed, their general ability, rather than they just got lucky or something like that.
Is that related to the most recent information you have also?
It's for sure. So that's availability, which is another one of the big heuristics. The availability.
Just before we get on to that, I just wanted to ask you a question. Representativeness, is this also a way of explaining nationalism, racism, and sexism? Because you're seeing a small sample, like you just watch the news, and you look at all these bad things that are happening in the world. The world must be a scary place.
For sure, and so is this other heuristic, availability, which I'll talk about. But absolutely, so we tend to. One of the famous examples in research on representativeness is what's called the Linda problem, And so the researchers have a scenario, and they say to you, okay, here's this woman. She likes to go to protests. She doesn't shave her armpits. I'm butchering this. This is the Linda problem.
Okay. It's Linda's problem.
It's the Linda problem because her name is Linda. Her name is Linda. And then, so they give all these kind of stereotypical characteristics of a feminist, but they never call her a feminist. They don't say anything specifically directly related to being a feminist, just things that are kind of stereotypes associated with it. And then they say, what's more likely? Linda, and they have 4 responses. One response is Linda is a bank teller. And another response is Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. And the 2 other responses are
get a job, Linda.
Something different. People circle Linda as a bank teller and a feminist more often than that Linda's a bank teller. They think bank teller and a feminist is more likely. There's a lot of debate about whether we should interpret it this way. But if you know a little bit of math or have some intuition about math, it can't be more likely that she's both a feminist and a bank teller than that she's a bank teller. If she's a feminist and a bank teller, she is a bank teller. So if there's any probability at all that she's not a feminist, A would be more likely that she's just a bank teller. So clearly, when you think about it that way, B is not more likely than A. It's not more likely that she's a feminist and a bank teller. But so one of the big arguments they make is we ignore what's called base rates. Base rates are kinds of frequencies in the population. So there's all this research showing that when we ask people, one of the biggest issues for this is with doctors. So if we look at on the back of a birth control or a pregnancy test, and on the back of any pill, they will tell you that is like a test for some kind of health, like an AIDS test or some kind of illness test. It will always tell you the frequency of false positives, which are the cases where it says, yes, you do have this thing even though you don't, and the frequency of false negatives, which are the cases where it says, no, you don't have this, even though you do. So in the case of a pregnancy test, a false positive would say you're pregnant even though you're really not, and a false negative would say you're not pregnant even though you really are. And on the back of the bottles, they'll always tell that, and doctors know how to look at that. If it says like, okay, 1% false positives, and you ask a doctor, what's the likelihood that the person isn't pregnant, even though it said they were, the doctor would say, well, there's a 1% likelihood, and so would probably you. That seems intuitive. But those tests are not taking into account the frequency in the population of those things. So imagine to make it more intuitive, imagine that it's not a pregnancy test where usually when you take that test, it might be around 50-50. But a test for some disease that only affects 1 in 10,000 people. Okay. I don't know what that is. Let's say it's an AIDS test. If the AIDS test has a false positive rate, says you have AIDS, and you look at the back and it says 1% of the time it's going to be wrong. You go in, you get an AIDS test, just a standard process of maybe you're getting checked for work. You get this AIDS test and it says you have AIDS. So there's a 1 in 100 chance if you just took 100 healthy people, there's a 1 in 100 chance that test would be wrong. Should the doctor say, okay, there's a 99% chance you have AIDS and a 1% chance you don't? Most doctors, because they're not trained in probability, they're not trained in judgment and decision making, will say yes. But that ignores the base rate. The base rate in the population, if it's 1 in 10,000 people have it, it's actually much more likely that test is wrong than that you actually have AIDS. Because there's 1 in 10,000 chance that you have AIDS. There's 1 in 100 chance that this test is wrong.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And we ignore that. And there's mathematical formulas, Bayes theory, basically, that will tell you exactly how to calculate the true likelihood given the base rate and given the test.
But I mean, the test rate is testing for AIDS, whereas the 1 in 10,000 is just a statistic, though.
Right, but the actual likelihood. The 1 in 100. No, the 1 in 100 is assuming that you don't have AIDS. How often will this test be wrong? But that assumption that you don't have AIDS is not the real population. So the test will be wrong 1% of the time, assuming you don't have AIDS. But what to figure out, given that test probability, which has nothing to do with the real world, it has nothing to do with the populations. The test probability is the thing that's just a statistic because it does not take into account frequencies and populations. So if you imagine we say, okay, I have a test. It's right or wrong 50% of the time. This will hopefully make it more intuitive. That's a 50% false positive rate and a 50% false negative rate. It's right or wrong 50% of the time, just to make it simple. And I say, okay, I'm going to go, and it's a likelihood that somebody's going to commit murder. And I'm going to go and take a random person off the street. And we know that really people commit murder 1 in a million, let's say. And I use this test, and it says, okay,
you're 50% likely to.
Oh, this guy's a murderer.
Right.
Well, now we think that there's a 50% chance this guy's a murderer. That's just wrong. That's just dead wrong.
Right.
And the fact that doctors themselves aren't trained to understand this, and we'll use these test statistics
to
tell you about how likely you are to have this disease without looking at the base rates.
Completely
unaware.
Right.
And that's the professionals. And so when more and more doctors are becoming aware of this, because there's been enough research published on this that they don't, and doctors aren't trained in probability and decision making. So these are these heuristics, and the heuristics generally are then used. These rules of thumb.
This is all of us, basically, right? You're saying
that's what these. That's So the premise here is I'm telling you a little bit of the history of psychology. So the assumption with these scholars is this is human psychology, but as we were talking about cultural psychology, almost all of this research is done on white, American, undergraduate.
Western,
educated psychology students.
So a small sample size. We need
not just a small sample size, but a very particular demographic, a very, very narrow sample. We don't think of it as a narrow sample because they're like us. If you're a psychology scholar, if you're a psychology researcher, these are the normal people. They're just like me. So we don't think that we need to go look all around the world. But the fact of the matter is, most of the research, when you actually start to do it in different environments, you see that
culture plays a
big role.
So
in some sense, even this research, what I was talking about, the representativeness heuristic, which is assuming the sample is representative regardless of base rates, for example, is an example of the representativeness heuristic at work. We're assuming that this one group is representative of all people. But in fact, when we go out and we look at people around the world, we find out it wasn't what was built into our brain. It's an interaction between how our brain's designed and how we were raised.
Do you think that's kind of more accepted now, that we need to look more culturally?
It's definitely more accepted now. It's still not the norm at all in psychology. So the whole talk about, and this is what I wanted to say about decision making, the whole talk about built-in biases. A lot of the most interesting books and a lot of the research right now is super popular in business right now. It's no coincidence that Kahneman won the Nobel Prize. This last year, a guy named Richard Thaler won the most recent Nobel Prize winner, is the kind of father of behavioral economics. Basically, he was a collaborator with Tversky and Kahneman. He was an economist, though, where they're psychologists. So he took a lot of their ideas. He did his own research, of course, but he basically is the guy who's responsible for taking that psychology research and getting it to be big in economics. So all these books out there, Predictably Irrational, all these books about how we're systematically biased are, in my view, and the thing I care about a lot is they put it all into the brain. They say this is how the mind works. All humans are like this. To some extent, a lot of these things will affect all of us, but to a large extent, a lot of the reasons we may, and there's a counter argument, which I buy, which I believe. The counter argument goes something like this. Yeah, heuristics, these rules of thumb we use, will lead to systematically bad choices in certain environments. There's no question. If you took a bird and you put it underwater, it might try to fly. That's a heuristic, the flying heuristic, let's say. If you put it on a spaceship in space, it might try to fly, and it wouldn't be a very adaptive choice. It wouldn't go anywhere while it's flying with no gravity, with no resistance in the air, right? Would you say, oh, that bird's so dumb?
That's just trying to do what it has been
taught,
or
hopefully we wouldn't think the bird's dumb for trying to fly in space. We know birds didn't evolve in space. They don't spend time in space. Right. But what we have right now is a 50-year tradition of psychologists setting up really creative experiments, putting people in really artificial environments to test a model of rationality and saying, look at how people make stupid choices in these very artificial environments. So what a lot of graduate students who are studying decision psychology, who are learning how systematically biased we are, how we're irrational, are learning almost entirely about how heuristics make us make bad choices. What they're not learning is that these heuristics exist because for the most part, they help us make good choices. That overwhelmingly they work. Certain environments they don't. So if you learn not to do things like use representativeness, you are introducing a whole new kind of bias in a sense, because representativeness for the most part
It's helpful.
works.
Yeah, right.
It helps us. It's adaptive. And so there's a big...
So is it basically that we kind of have to make bad choices in some cases that might harm us, but for the most part, if we're rational and we follow these heuristics, that we'll be okay.
It's a big open question. To what extent? So you could say, here's a person, they're born into a culture. Their rule of thumb is, I find people I respect and I just copy what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Another person is born and their belief is, I should always weigh costs and benefits. I should try to get numerical quantitative data for everything and add up all the costs and all the benefits.
Make a decision
Based on that. I shouldn't be influenced by other people's beliefs and strategies, because then I would just be a sheep. I should be a rational decision maker.
And that's how you get the missiles launching, right?
I don't know, but it's an open question. Which one of those two people would do better, and which one would do better depend on the environment itself. Mm-hmm. If you're in a very stable environment that doesn't change much over time, elders or cultural evolution itself will give you answers to things. So how do we decide what berries to eat? If we're going to go out as a rational decision maker and just trial and error, we're going to die.
Yeah.
So we are able to learn rules that are passed on to us, and you'll see there's huge cultural differences in the extent to which people believe that the rational choice model itself is the right way to make decisions.
Okay, so on a hopeful note,
Yeah.
would you agree with this statement? The best thing we could do is be aware of the processes in the environment and in our head, and once we're aware, then we have something to work with.
I think it's great to study this stuff a little bit, as long as I don't think that learning about these biases is the best thing. I actually think it probably leads to more bad decisions than it does to good decisions. I hate to say it.
Really?
I think the best thing is...
Why would you say something like that?
Well, kind of for the reasons I said. So
you become very focused on these biases and like, oh, this one's bad, so I should not do this, correct? Which might
sort
lead
of.
to
So
another
if
bad.
you think representativeness is a bad heuristic, if you think to say, okay, so I'm given, like going back to this Linda example, that I'm given all these characteristics of a single person, should I say then, I need to figure out the base rates in the population, which almost nobody knows anyway, and you can't figure out anyway, so I'm going to ignore all that information I have? Or should you say,
generalize,
I'm going to make the best judgment I can given the information I have? Mm-hmm. The best judgment you have given the information that you can make given the information you have is often going to be the better way. So the person who's trained really strictly in decision science will often require more data than they have access to, will refuse to make judgments in cases where that other person will make wrong judgments a lot. So going back to that language of false positives and false negatives, it's potential that the trained decision scientist who learns about all these biases makes a far fewer false positives, is not nearly as likely to make a statement that's not true. This other person that doesn't study it at all has all these false positives. But it's also potential that same group of decision scientists have many, many, many more false negatives. They refuse to make any generalizations, even in cases where they can. So if you think about the non-human environment, in the human environment, so going back to that hot hand cognitive illusion, basketball games, a lot of things that we invent and design, casinos, which is what I study, casino gambling, are artificially designed to be completely random. The world that we live in outside of human invention, there's very few things that are completely random, that the events are independent of one another. So you see a slot machine. A slot machine is this brilliant work of invention where there's three rings, and each ring might have 20 items on it.
There's a probability of
and
one combination each
exactly, and you could do the math,
spin.
and you could say, okay, 1 chance in 20 for each thing. The chance of getting 3 sevens then is 1 over 20 times 1 over 20 times 1 over 20. That turns out, so that would be a design environment. There's almost nothing in the world, in the non-human invented world, that's like that. So us using these shortcuts actually is much more adaptive. To add a little bit, that's not at all how slot machines are designed. They're actually not random. There's a much lower probability of getting 3 sevens than there is of getting 3 blanks, for example. And they have a chip inside that has a randomizing feature that is based on a completely different math that you wouldn't know. They're designed to look random though. And so I guess what I would say is, sorry to give such a long-winded answer to that question because
going.
it's an
No, it's
important
good.
question, but I would say I don't know whether and I have this debate with other people I know who think about this a lot. I don't know. It's a similar question about studying logic. Does studying logic help you make better arguments? I don't know. I think studying logic helps you get judgmental about other people's bad arguments. But I think reading good essays helps you make better arguments a lot more than studying logic would. I think living in the world helps you make better decisions. Having broad, rich experiences helps you make better decisions a lot more than studying decision theory. And a lot of decision theorists, because they know, this cliche of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm-hmm. If you're a decision theory, everything is about rationality and about probabilities and about bias. And you're missing so much of all the stuff we don't know in decision science that people actually really do have a good, solid understanding for. So we have respect for authority. The decision scientists don't, but maybe we have respect for authority for good reasons because we learn stuff, or we might have a respect for tradition. So I'll stop in a minute. But one of the things I studied in cultural psychology was something called sacred values, protected values. They are a problem for decision scientists. They're things that we say you shouldn't weigh costs and benefits for this thing. Not only shouldn't you do it, if you see somebody doing it, it feels wrong. So I'll give you a concrete example. If I said to you, Vinny, sorry for the name, do you go by Vinny in this?
Yeah, sure.
Vinny, how much would you sell me your mother for?
Would I what?
Sell me your mother for.
Yikes.
If you thought I was serious,
All right.
you would think I should get arrested. If you thought I was just joking, you might think that's pretty poor humor. One thing you wouldn't do is pause for a second and think reflectively about how much money you would want to sell your mother for. You wouldn't weigh costs and benefits in that domain. And in some ways, it's even more problematic because it's the domain that you care the most about that you think it's wrong to weigh costs and benefits for, life in this case. So we were studying cultural differences in these sacred values.
So there are some people that probably would sell their mothers, though.
There are some people, and you would call
There
those
is a
people
price.
sick, and you would think those people should be locked up, and we don't want those people in our society.
Now, is there a correlation between resources and sacredness? Because as you were talking, I was saying, well, what about water? There's places that are running out of water.
Absolutely.
And as they run out of water, water becomes more sacred, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And people will fight over resources.
For sure. So we the groups that we were looking at were Evangelical Christians, and a very particular Evangelical Christians. Like they would have speaking in tongues. They would collapse on the ground. Well, they would say non-denominational. They weren't snake handlers. They weren't,
okay.
but really intense, really strong beliefs. Another group were Menominee, Native American Indians, and so we were in an area where we had these different groups all together, and white hunters and fishermen. And the Menominee were all pretty much hunters and fishermen. And one of the things we were looking at is values about autonomy. And for sure, for the Menominee, autonomy is a value that, because it's a threatened value, is much more sacred than it is for the other two groups. Autonomy to make your own laws, to make your own decisions about hunting practices and things like that. For the white hunters and fishermen, there was another kind of autonomy that was really, really sacred, which is about guns, because there everybody hunts, and it's a family practice. It's a long tradition. They're much safer with guns.
Like
They'll
a tool for survival.
Tool for survival. So you look at, and so when you bring up about costs and benefits for any of these groups for different kinds of goods,
All right.
they will not want to weigh the costs and benefits at all. But one of the things that to me was the most interesting is about the why. Which is pretty different, and it's pretty different from what somebody who's trained in decision science will tell you about why not. Might have different reasons. The main reason they'll say is, well, they're irrational. When you talk to a Menominee, it's humility. They will say, look, we have this belief that if something has worked for 7 generations, then we should have the humility to respect that tradition. Mm-hmm. That traditions have a wisdom of their own. And you could say, well, that's dumb. But if, to the extent cultural evolution itself has a wisdom, which it clearly does, the same way that biological evolution, things evolve, they adapt to an environment. If cultures adapt to an environment, there is wisdom in cultural practices that we don't know why they work. They just do. It's not that they just do. There was a trial and error system that was outside of any individual human's understanding of the process, where we as cultures have invented amazing things, have discovered amazing things, have practices that work for reasons that we have wrong beliefs about why they work, but do work. So to the extent that the Menominee had that humility, they're making better decisions than the person who says weigh costs and benefits would, because they're saying we don't know the costs and benefits. The Evangelical Christians were saying something really interestingly similar. It wasn't about tradition. It was about God. But again, it was about humility. It was saying, we're trusting in this book, which you and I might say let's stop doing that. That book we can't trust in. But we're trusting in these sets of beliefs, and it often isn't a book. It's about their pastor. It's about how they interpret what God says.
Through him.
They're saying through him.
Yeah.
But a lot of the lessons that they're getting about what God says are lessons that are really just moral, developmental training. Like, about love, about things, about rules of thumb, about how to live life, about adultery. We rational decision analysts might say, okay, what are the odds I'm going to get caught if I cheat on my wife or I cheat on my husband? Okay, what's the pleasure I'm getting? The odds are low. We're not that good in some domains at estimating the costs. We don't think through the loss of our children's love, the loss of our spouse forever, the fact that all our coworkers will judge us. Those are things we aren't good at even learning. And so maybe it happens to somebody and they say, no, you don't do that. The father says that to the son or whatever.
Right. Because he went through it maybe.
Because he went through it. He learned it in a way that we can't learn through trying to be a rational utility.
Exactly.
And so they passed those rules on. And so basically both the evangelicals and the Menominee had a kind of humility that is sadly missing from judgment and decision researchers who think that they're rational and everybody else isn't. And that's a long-winded answer to say why I don't think the answer is you should just study these things and then you're better off. My answer is we should all have a lot more humility when we're in the face of people who have really different views about what is rational. We should be a lot more aware of how much our samples of the environment are biased samples. It's not about our biased brain, it's about our biased environment. Our environments are systematically not representative. We weird people feel like we're in a representative environment, but we're not. And so does everybody else.
Right. Everyone's in their own little bubble.
And this is a popular topic right now, but it's true, I think. And to the extent that we're not aware of that, we think other people are less rational than we are, and that to me is a much bigger problem. So my answer would be, is the standard, this is a guy named Rick Schwader, who's a really important figure in cultural psychology, and then I'll stop, is the best way to be objective about the world. There is no such thing as a view from nowhere. There is no such thing as an objective perspective. Where can you see things from nowhere? We don't. We see things from a perspective.
Right.
So the best way to get an objective perspective is not to try to see things from nowhere, from some non-contextual perspective, which is what psychologists often try to do. It's to try to get as many different perspectives as you can. So if you know the parable of the blind men and the elephant, one feels the tail, one feels the tusk, one feels the skin, and each of them describes the elephant differently. But the one who gets all 5 different feelings of the elephant will have a more full picture of what an elephant really looks like. That is kind of the lesson of cultural psychology. Is that that's why you study multiple different cultures, is because you get different perspectives of the world that help you in the end to get a more objective picture, which isn't a view from nowhere. It's a pluralistic view. It's a view from many places.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. We're running out of time here.
No,
so,
good. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for this conversation. Do you want to tell anybody about your website for Locust?
Sure. Locust Workspace, LOCUS. Not the ravaging insect, but essential activity.
All right.
Workspace.com is fine.
Also,
we'll show pictures of the website as well.
Great.
Yeah, for those people who wanted to explore these topics more, are there some resources that you could give these people who want to learn more about cultural psychology or decision making?
Sure. And I'm making one side sound more right than the other, but all these sides, the economists who still believe assuming people are rational decision makers is the best thing to do, may very well be the best way to predict economic markets. And if you want to read about kind of rational choice theory in economics, there's a lot of, I would just say Google it really, like Wikipedia. For a quick understanding of that, Wikipedia is great. For the psychologists who are criticizing rational choice theory, Thinking Fast and Slow is maybe the best popular reference. Predictably Irrational is really nice. Nudge is really nice, which is Thaler's, the guy who just won the Nobel Prize wrote a book called Nudge, which is nice. It talks a lot about the environment, so I like that, about how you can change the environment to help reduce biases. For cultural psychologists and how they think about it, this weird article is pretty readable, even though it's still an academic article. There isn't
You know the authors?
Yeah, so Joe Henrich,
Okay.
Noren Zion, and geez, I
Just
should know the
W-E-I-R-D.
three, but it does. Joe Henrich is the lead author.
Joe Henrich. Okay.
Yeah, but also, to me, cultural psychology is the most interesting. It's kind of about how language influences thought, about how your environment influences how the mind works. Obviously, I'm biased myself because it's the field I have the most background in.
Well, we're all biased, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we learned today. I think. There's no hope for humanity. All right, Will.
That's not the lesson, damn it.
Oh, all right. All right, well, thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Will.
Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Do This With Your Life. Now, I've got a question for you. Do you know anyone specifically that you think this episode could help? If so, please share this podcast with that person. The purpose of this show is to help people overcome challenges, solve problems, and take the next step in life. If you think that's a worthy cause, please visit our website, dothispodcast.com, and click on the button to become a patron of our show. Any little donation helps. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. There you can follow us, you can leave comments, ideas for future shows, and receive notifications every time we release an episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and remember, you are the reason we do this podcast.